Okay, about Hayek's version of the invisible hand. We can remember in this respect the famous transformational model of social activity of Bhaskars and Giddens. And again, this is an instance, Hayek's model, Hayek's understanding, is an instance of the working of the unintended consequences. You know, people, individuals have their own intentions and their own actions based upon these intentions. But these actions will create some unintended results, unintended or unplanned consequences of action. So through these unintended consequences, the market structure will emerge and work efficiently, which is also stable. So it's a perfect example of the notion of the invisible hand, but still the question still begs, which is again and again, we ask the same question: why should it create an optimal result? Why should the unintended consequences hypothesis will create the best results? It's a kind of, again, Hayek's understanding of the invisible hand is again a kind of Panglossian picture, right? It provides us with a Panglossian picture or a Leibnizian picture, if you will. This is the best of all possible worlds. This argument is actually, we can say that it's the cornerstone of Hayek's criticism against central planning agency. He believes that any centrally coordinated agency, such as the planning agency, will not be successful. It will fail eventually because of this fact that competition works in a dynamic environment and it takes place as a kind of process. You know, this piecemeal information, the relevant information of the relative scarcities will always change. They keep changing in the real time. So each time they change, the planning agency must devise a new plan and act accordingly, etc., etc. No central agency is capable of this. No central agency is capable of collecting this infinite amount of information, and no central agency is capable of processing this information and act on the basis of these constantly changing information. But the market system, according to Hayek, is capable of doing that. So there should be no outside intervention into the working of the market. So the only reason for the existence of market imperfections or failures in general is basically because of the interventions on the part of the state. But still, this process emerges spontaneously, automatically. It's again a form of Cunningham-Prism model. In this transformational model of social activity, on the other hand, there's no mention of any kind of optimal outcomes. You know, how I can put this, for example, in Marx, we have a similar understanding, interestingly. And even Karl Popper once told Karl Polanyi that, according to his memoir, it is Marx who, more or less, one of the few thinkers who emphasize the importance of these unintended consequences. You know, in Marx, we have a similar picture. You know, social relations, capital is a social relation, for example, commodity is a social relation, and these relations occur behind the backs of individuals, so to speak. So they are results or consequences of intentional action of individuals, but they are unintended consequences. But in Marx, there's no way, there's no role for the thought that these actions will always create some optimal results, optimal for the capitalists or optimal for the working class, if you will. So in every action will have some consequences, unintended consequences even, but there's no need for these consequences to produce optimal effects in general. But in Hayek, or in the liberal thinking in general, we have this kind of understanding. Invisible hands always create efficient results, but this is not the case always. In recent times, for example, some people argue that there may be some consequences that create a kind of invisible backhand, or malign invisible hand, or even evolutionary hand with dissipative structures is always possible. These type of conceptions do not consider evolution as an optimization process. We have so much about that. We have said so much about that. They entail a dynamic conception of evolution involving complexity, in which the idiosyncrasies in and interactions among various parts that form the organism or the system may change or even deteriorate the operation of the system as a whole. So invisible hand, true, it emerges as unintended consequences of intentional human action, but they may create some inefficiencies. These results may be inefficient, so there's no reason to assume that the final order emerging out of individual action will be efficient or optimal or even Panglossian. This process, again, in Hayek, we have the same understanding of evolution. Evolution is the market system, is the result of a long history of evolution, so to speak. Again, a similar perspective is presented in the founder of Austrian school and neoclassical economics in general, Karl Menger. And Karl Menger explains the emergence of money, for example, on the basis of this mechanism as actions and unintended consequences of actions. He argues that, for example, in the beginning, people started with the barter in the exchange process, and in time, people preferred some goods among others, such as gold, silver, or the money must have some. We are talking about commodity money, of course, must have some properties that should make them proper for exchanges as a kind of medium exchange. So in time, through the long history of evolution, money, commodity money systems emerged and functioned in a way. So Hayek's understanding about the emergence of the market system is quite similar. He too sees the emergence of the market system as a product of an evolutionary process, but still we have the same problem, right? Why this evolution will result in optimal processes or optimal institutions such as the market that works in an efficient manner, etc. So this process is an evolutionary process. In this evolutionary process, there will be some ruptures, repeated hikes, and mutations. And these mutations do not necessarily generate optimal outcomes. If an emergent process with an unknown outcome, where the norms of the system change by themselves, this is the Schumpeterian understanding of the notion of development, is in question, then the development of the system leads to the mutation of the parameters or norms that define the very system. Thus, the system moves from one norm to another. So this evolution does not take place in a gradual way, as in the principle of natura non possit saltum, nature does not make leaps. On the contrary, nature or evolution or the development of any social structure or institution may create some ruptures some leaps, some hikes, revolutions, etc., etc. And second, this evolution will not create the best results. It is not a Panglossian view of the working of capitalism. So this is the idea of the notion of evolutionary hand, which was put forward by Giovanni Dossi and his friends in their study on technology, etc. However, according to Schumpeter, again, this transition cannot be decomposed, transition from one state or one norm to another, into infinitesimal steps. It's not gradual. Nature does make leaps. According to this understanding, equilibrium should be approached not as a state of rest that comes out as a consequence of balance between forces, as in the Newtonian tradition. It's a kind of Boltzmannian point of view. In other words, changes not involving structural changes. Within the context of a non-equilibrium analysis, in which the change in the norms of the system is not an exception but a rule, a framework involving nonlinear, irreversible change, self-organization, complexity, and dissipative structures, a notion of order that emerges within change should be taken into consideration. So Hayek, as in the other liberal traditions, is wrong in this regard. First, evolution or the emergence or the working of the invisible hand in general, it's spontaneous, yes, but it does not create always the best results. Second, this evolutionary process itself is not gradual. It occurs through leaps, hikes, ruptures, and even revolutions. So, in other words, invisible hand, though it creates a kind of order, there is no reason for order to be stable. It may disappear, or there may be a new kind of order to be established through in a revolutionary period, maybe. That's as in Marx argues, for example. So on the basis of this dynamic or evolutionary outlook, we can distinguish between liberal and evolutionary approaches in general. Static or comparative static ideas, as in the formal general equilibrium model, and even in Hayek or the Austrian school, change is causal and quantitative, it's functional, linear, reversible. Equilibrium is to be conceived as a kind of Newtonian understanding, balance of forces, there is demand and supply. So if there's a balance between demand and supply, we have a market equilibrium price, etc., etc. And the adjustment towards new equilibrium will take place in an instant manner, instantaneously. There's no time necessary for this whole adjustment process to take place. And order is spontaneous and stable. It's Panglossian, the best of all possible worlds. Evolutionary process is akin to natural selection process. It's based upon tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge means that the knowledge, information that is reflected in the prices, basically, and they are definite, determined, and efficient outcomes. This is the idea of invisible hand in the liberal tradition or the neoclassical school in general, including the Austrian version of the neoclassical school. And on the other hand, in the Schumpeterian approach in general, Schumpeter himself is an Austrian, but he's a kind of different Austrian because he considers these ruptures or changes or the fact that evolution does not take place gradually. It's the leap of the system from one norm or one structure, so to speak, to another one. So development, evolution, it's based upon novelty in Schumpeter's. He says basically evolution, this development is caused by the entrepreneur. whose function is to introduce new novelties, inventions. This is the idea of the creative destruction process. Novelty may take place in the form of introduction of a new product, a new production method, a new outlook, a new understanding of the environment, etc., etc. But in each cases, the entrepreneur will get her profit as a result of her introduction of this novelty. And as these novelties, innovations, are introduced, the old structures will change and they will be destroyed by the introduction of these inventions. That's the process of creative destruction. And this development process or evolutionary process is adaptive, it's non-linear, also irreversible. It's not reversible as in the Newtonian structure. And there are always some bifurcations. System may enter a new path even in a random manner, as in the idea of the punctuated equilibrium conception, remember. And equilibrium is a kind of thermodynamic equilibrium, which means the absence of structural change. So we have to talk about non-equilibrium. This distinction between disequilibrium and non-equilibrium is not just a matter of semantics. It's more important than that. In the case of disequilibrium, we have to be confined within the same Newtonian, mostly, structure. But if you are to consider non-equilibrium, even we don't have to mention the existence of equilibrium, because as in the working of competition, even in the Austrian understanding, these processes occur in historical time and they are continuous, but not necessarily gradual. But they may not be even continuous. Continuous in the sense that evolution is an important aspect of social change or any kind of change. But still there may be ruptures or revolutions or leaps in general in this process. So we don't need to seek out equilibrium states. There may be equilibria, as in the punctuated equilibrium approach, but these equilibria are destined to be, so to speak, dissipated in general. So they are self-organized, the order, emerged order. It's unstable and dissipative, and the order is based upon routines, but the very function of the entrepreneur in Schumpeter is to break with these routines. That's one of the most important differences between Hayek and general Austrian understanding and Schumpeter's conception of entrepreneur. In the Austrian tradition, as in Hayek, entrepreneurs just passive, so to speak, collectives of information that are to be reflected in the prices. But in Schumpeter, this entrepreneur is an active agent that is powerful enough to shape the whole structure, even change or transform the whole structure of the market system. I mean, it's working at least through her introduction of novelties in the form of innovations. That process actually is the dynamic conception of competition in general. This dynamic conception of competition also appears in Adam Smith himself. According to Adam Smith, the competition has two important functions in a capitalist economy. One, it creates some forces of equilibrium. It has an equilibrating function. In the long run, at least, through the free competition, the market system is capable of creating natural prices which reflect long-run equilibrium prices. We are talking about prices of production in general. But at the same time, Adam Smith also emphasizes the importance of novelties, technological changes in general. Even if he mentions the importance of the invisible hand, he also emphasizes the importance of technological changes because the pressure of competition on the entrepreneurs or on the capitalists in general will force them to introduce these kind of technological inventions or innovations. Adam Smith talked about the Industrial Revolution, and also Schumpeter got his idea from the important entrepreneurs in the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in England. So their understanding are more or less similar. So in Adam Smith, competition has two functions. One, it has the tendency to create equilibrium, yes, but at the same time, competition also has the tendency to introduce some disequilibrium possibilities through technological changes. His famous discussion on the division of labor, which can be taken as more or less similar to the introduction of technological changes in general. So in the division of labor, the system will have a dynamic character, and its dynamic character will be caused by the competition process in general that works in two ways, in two contradictory ways, for sure. One is the elements of equilibrating forces, and the other is existence of, again, disequilibrating forces in the form of technological changes. A similar conception is adopted by Marx, who followed Adam Smith in that respect, but it is Schumpeter actually who emphasized in the strongest way, so to speak, of the importance of novelties and changes in the structure, very structure of the system. So according to this approach, random mutations or innovations, in our example, can be introduced, can happen in the evolutionary process. And this evolutionary process, or the evolutionary hand, is emergent, it's indeterminate, and unknown outcomes. It has some unknown outcomes. It's impossible, in general, to foresee or predict these results. These results will occur through the unintended consequences again, but it's hard, even impossible, to foresee these effects. So we have a system, we have an order here, which emerges out of individual actions as unintended consequences, but there's no reason to assume that, first, this order is efficient, it functions efficiently in an optimal manner, and second, there's no reason to assume that it will be stable. So this is a quite different picture or understanding of the notion of invisible hand. Instead of invisible hand, in other words, we can say we have to talk about the working of the evolutionary hand or invisible backhand or whatever. There's what's in a name, a rose is a rose, right? Maybe we should stop here. But still maybe we should not, sorry. So we can talk about, as a summary, three versions of the unintended consequences, working of the unintended consequences. One is the invisible hand of Hayek's or the liberal tradition in general, harmonious order. They are the social harmony, they are more or less social contract theories, emphasize the optimal order, basically individualist, and based a kind of social atomistic understanding, or at least methodological individualist position. Second, the invisible hand, backhand, non-efficient order. Suboptimal reproduction, the frictions are always possible, inefficiencies, etc. is possible. External elements creating hitches. The Keynesian idea, basically, that unemployment is Involuntary unemployment is possible in a market system, even if you leave the market mechanism to its own devices. It may not always create a kind of full employment equilibrium. That's the famous critique by Keynes of the idea of sales law. It's a kind of invisible backhand. To be sure, there is also a kind of order here, which Keynes believes in, actually, but at the same time, there's no reason for this order to be optimal or to be Panglossian. And the third one is the evolutionary hand. Even this order is possible through the working of the unintended consequences, anticipative structures. They emphasize creation and reproduction of the system or society or whatever, allows imperfections and suboptimalities, and they are usually associated with non-individualistic approaches. They are usually criticizing social atomistic positions like Polanyi or Marx even Schumpeter as important representatives. Okay, now we should stop. See you next week then.